it's very vague just to say we're going to reform a sector and it's going to save us 50 billion and that means we can reduce everyone's taxes. That's a very vague, but at least no one can really argue with it. As soon as you start saying we're going to cut personal allowance, we're going to raise it up to 20 grand, that's a real policy that you can cost. And then people who I would say reform voters feel pragmatic are going to see that and think, oh, that doesn't line up. Hello, everyone. It's been a while. We're sorry. Go on, Charlie. Tell them how sorry you are.
I'm so sorry. I'm really, really sorry. I'll take full responsibility.
I don't mean
is that what you wanted?
Fault,
So I felt nervous. I felt put on the spot then. Do you see how quickly I caved? Bloody hell. I feel so emasculated.
Oh, this is great fun. Whenever something goes wrong, I'm just going to point.
Yeah, but I didn't realise. I've just learned something about myself. Bloody hell. I would not be good under a dictatorship. Bloody hell. Oh, well, we obviously, we forgot the Spotify password, but we've now remembered it. You know, we've aligned the calendars. We've made up from all of our irreconcilable arguments that we'd had, you know, so we're all good. We're back into the frame. Yeah.
We are, and we're coming back with a bang because this is a nice and easy one that everyone can get involved in. We're talking about political messaging today. So what should the parties be saying? What are they saying? And this is one where really people at home can join in because anecdotal data matters. You know, how you've experienced Labour's messaging is as good a data point as any, really. So I think this is a great one. What do you think, Charlie?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously living in a democracy, it's the thing that really only does, well, thank God I live in a democracy. But the thing that only really matters is you can have the best political messaging, you can have the best economic strategy, you can have the best policies, you can have the most technocratic, you know, right thing to do. But if you can't sell the message, then you're not going to be able to get the political capital to be able to implement that policy. So this is fundamentally at the root of what all of our podcast is about. And I remember originally we said we wouldn't really do politics much, but as this incredibly boring Labour government has gone on, I think we're starting to really understand the importance of selling a vision, Keir.
Yeah, we sold out pretty quickly. I would
say.
Yeah,
really quick.
Which is something
really
I found about myself, which is great. So there we go. We both found out.
We sold out for literally no money at all. I mean, no. So again,
just for one extra view.
Yeah,
that's it. Well, today, the agenda, I think, the plan is... So Charlie's going to provide a bit of context, which is going to be some polling data about how people feel about everyone. Surprise news, Labour is not popular.
Nope.
And then and then we're going to go into maybe ranking who's got the hardest job, who's got the easiest job. That's going to be pretty obvious, I think. And then we're going to explain what we think each party should be saying or their messaging should be. So without further ado, Charlie, take it away.
Let's do it. Yeah, so obviously... We're talking about the main four political parties today, just to save on time. And so what we've got is obviously Labour, the Conservatives, Reform, and the Liberal Democrats. And so, yeah, as Jack said, the main trend that we see from the polling data is that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in general are just becoming very, very unpopular. And by very unpopular, I mean that about 23% of people, when polled, view the Prime Minister favourably. And I don't know about you, Jack, but this is why I could not be a frontline politician. If you wake up on a Monday morning, you know, it's early, you probably woke up 5 o'clock, you haven't had a morning coffee, and then your strategist comes in and says, listen, pal, you're doing really well. 1 in 5 people in the UK don't hate you. And I'd just be like, you know, that's a hard one to stomach. But fair play to Keir, you know. Yeah, I mean, he's incredibly unpopular. Lowest rating he's ever had by YouGov, which is sort of the big wig of the polling companies. You know, nearly 70% of people now have an unfavourable opinion of Labour. And critically, he's particularly unpopular among Labour voters who voted Labour in 2014.
Not what you want, is it?
No, it's the first time he's had a negative approval rating among Labour voters, meaning basically people dislike him more than they like him, which is rough, given that they originally did like you, which is worse. And so where are these voters going? You know, predominantly what we see as well is, you know, Reform are doing very, very well. Nigel Farage has increased dramatically in the opinion polls, and Reform is doing very well, as broadly as a political party. Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, is the most unpopular of the four leaders.
Not a huge surprise, but
just 16%, Jack. I say they have a favourable opinion of the Tory leader. It's the joint lowest she's ever had since she beat Robert Jenrick in the Conservative leadership race. And so, just 1 in 6 Britons actually approve of her. And then Ed Davey is my favourite statistic of all, because people literally could not give less of anything about Ed Davey, right?
Well, he is safe. Yep.
Yeah, well, saved it. People just don't care about him. 40% of people have no opinion on Ed Davey. And, obviously we were just saying it must feel really hard for the soul to be like, 1 in 5 people actually don't mind me. For like 40% of people to know who you are and also not care. Imagine being at a party.
So they do know of him. So it's not...
Yes. You imagine walking into a party and being like, oh yeah, nice to meet you. And, they want to come over to Kimmy to say that she's, not doing a very good job. And then Ed Davey walks in and it's like, oh, hi. And people just don't acknowledge him at all.
Oh, yeah. At the party, everyone's gone over to Kimmy and Keir to throw tomatoes at them. And he's just there trying to hand out tomatoes. Like, please throw something at me. Like be interested. He's there with his plate of hors d'oeuvres or whatever, just picking his cocktail sausage.
Yeah, 20% of people like him, 20% of people don't like him, and then 40% just do not care. Which I guess pretty much epitomises Lib Dems, who are the Hufflepuff of political parties.
So rude. So rude. But it's true, isn't it? They do feel like...
Yeah, that's pretty much Ed Davey, as you'd imagine. So honourable mentions, or dishonourable mentions, I say, Rachel Reeves is incredibly unpopular. And that's going to really inform Labour's strategy going forward, I think. But minus 48 net approval rating, which is incredibly low. And we'll get on into... And I think that is partially... I think Rachel Reeves is actually dragging down Labour's opinions more so than Keir Starmer is. Well, she obviously is. So yeah, that's going to be a fascinating part of their strategy going forward. But yeah, pretty dire for the Labour Party, Jack.
It's not looking good, yeah. But how do the policies line up? Like, what are people interested in these parties?
Yeah, well, so that's obviously the next sort of big question is where are Labour hemorrhaging votes to? All right, and so just to sort of give some highlight of some of the voting intentions of people that voted Labour last time, only 58% say they'd vote for Labour again. 17% said they'd vote Lib Dem. 9% they said they'd vote Reform. For the Conservatives, again, only 58% of Conservatives who voted for them in the last election said they'd stay. And 33% would go to Reform. So what you really see, and you'll see this in your question, I haven't forgotten about it, Jack, about the policy importance, but you really do see that they're fighting these two separate sub-battles. It's very much Labour versus Lib Dem, and Reform versus Conservatives. And I think it's going to be really important when we talk about political strategy, because you don't want Labour starting to reach across the aisle and trying to pick fights with Reform, from a strategy polling point of view, because that is not who their fight is with. Labour's fight is very much with Lib Dems, and the Conservatives' fight is very much with Reform. And you see this in the policy importance. Among Labour and Liberal Democrats, the economy is by far the most important thing that they care about. Then you have the economy, and then you have immigration. So those are the three big things, which do carry over across different voting categories. But yeah, the economy and health are the two biggest things, that obviously the NHS, with like left-wing Labour Liberal voters. And with Reform and Conservative, it is immigration. I mean, that is their number one. 74 to 80% of people among Conservative and Reform voters, that's their key priority. Then you have the economy much further down, and then you have health much further down after that. So it's very much a economy, NHS battle versus a immigration battle. And that seems to be the real sort of thing that defines this debate.
And that's interesting. If you're saying it's two separate sides, because if you were to judge Labour's policies right now, you'd feel like they're more trying to appease the Reforms and Conservatives with attacking the welfare state and immigration. I mean, maybe that's just genuinely they're technocrats and think this is something that needs reforming, and they're just trying to do a good job. Fair enough. But if you're looking at this political strategy-wise, they should be appeasing Lib Dems more. Am I right? Or...
Yeah. Given that we have got our cynical hat on today, Jack, we've taken a break from our little wholesome little economics podcast. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely part of their political strategy, isn't it? And obviously, symmetrically, you see that with Reform. Reform are very much looking and just going, oh, we just need to grab votes from everywhere. And so now Reform is trying to fight with Labour. And I think if you're a strategist and a polling statistician here, you go, oh, no. You really want to stay within your own fan bases. And you see this with the type of people that are voting for each. You know, when you look at the data, it's very clear that Reform and Conservatives are more popular among older people with lower education and lower skilled jobs, and people with lower employment probabilities. And pensioners make up a huge proportion of the Conservative Reform base, predominantly Conservatives, but a lot of Reform as well. Where among Labour and Lib Dem supporters, you have a lot more people in high skilled jobs, more highly educated and younger people and students as well.
Right.
And so you're fighting for very different, almost polar opposite parts of society. And also the gender gap is really important here as well. I think Rory and Alistair talk about this a lot on their very famous podcast. But they say, you know, women are much more likely to vote for left-wing parties, to make it simple, you know, Labour and Lib Dem. And men are much more likely to vote for right-wing parties. And at the moment, men are much more likely to vote than women. And that sort of might be part of the drive we see with Reform here. And so that's basically the statistics. And my main takeaway, that if anyone takes anything away from this, is I really do believe that for a strategist within each of these parties, you have to stay true to your values and your base. And whether that you're Reform or Conservative, you cannot be branching out too much and reaching across the aisle, because you need to let each of these parties fight it out amongst themselves, I think, personally. Otherwise, you're going to make mistakes. I think we're seeing that with Reform and Labour at the moment.
That's an interesting idea there, Charlie. Okay, so before we get into talk about what the messages should be, shall we, I think it'll be a fun game, just try and rank. I think we have similar ideas of this, but rank who's got the hardest job down to who's got the easiest job. So
nice.
Do you want to start there? I mean, there's only one answer
so after
here, surely.
I mean, there's one answer to this one. I mean, yeah. Do you want to say it?
I think the Tories have by far the hardest job here.
Now, see, I disagree with you there, Jack.
No, I think if you come out of 14 years where you've had a chance to change things for the better, no one's going to trust any policy you come up with, because they're just going to turn around and be like, well, why didn't you do it then, you know?
Absolutely. And so you've got definitely the Tories at the bottom. And then I think that Labour have the next most difficult selling
Well, you
argument.
changed my mind on this, didn't you?
Yeah, for me, that's just because they are in government and because they've constrained themselves so much by their promises in the election. And you just have more constraints when you actually have to do things. Yeah. So I would say Labour's next. I don't know about you.
Yeah, you convinced me, I think. Only because you made me actually have to think about Lib Dems for once. And actually, before I thought there's not much Lib Dems could say, because Labour was sort of taking the very central part of the scale, which is pushing out Lib Dems. I was like, what could Lib Dems actually say? But actually, I think there's a lot, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it follows quite naturally then that it would be Lib Dems have the second easiest argument, and then Reform at the moment have the easiest, I guess, route to massive growth at the next general election, right?
I think so. The arguments are pretty simple, right? And they're effective. It's a simple, effective argument. Here's a scapegoat, and that's the blame. And also, this idea that for some reason, they've managed to twist this idea of before you would vote for major parties because they'd done it before, they're recognised as almost like a brand that they're going to be reliable. And that means you wouldn't vote for smaller parties because you don't think they would actually be able to organise themselves. Now there's sort of somehow they've managed to switch it that people see them as, right, the middle two parties, we feel so disillusioned with Labour and Tories that anyone would be better. And we trust a small, Reform fringe party made up of, odd jobs would be able to organise themselves and do something different. Basically, it's a mistrust in institutions. It's classic populism, isn't it? That we need something new.
And that's why the Labour, Lib Dems and Reform actually have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take advantage of this massive political churning that's going on.
Yeah.
And I think one party's doing that much better than the other, but we'll get onto that.
Well, let's start with that now, Charlie.
So I don't know what you think about this, Jack, but I think fundamentally Reform do have a much easier argument than the Conservatives. Obviously, you just said that. But populism in general, I think, has this way of taking a policy issue that people care about, really packaging that up in a really charismatic and simplistic way, and then presenting it as the policy solution to end all issues in the economy. And when you have charismatic people that can and also you get sort of the early mover advantage on that problem, like if you're the first one to highlight that as a problem, you can sort of develop a specialism within that and you become really good at it. And at the moment, that's what Reform has done. They've sort of capitalized on this particular policy issue, made it their thing, and for whatever reason, people have really latched onto it, and it's going to be their vehicle that sort of propels them. And along, you can sort of, everything else sort of revolves around that. It's a really simple, clear, prescriptable policy idea that to some people seems like it's going to fix everything. And I think that's a really easy vision to sell. I don't know about you.
Well, I think it's an easy vision to sell, provided that they don't start falling into these traps that they seem to be doing right now. I think they had been doing really well where they were being quite vague about what they were going to do. I mean, it's very vague just to say we're going to reform a sector and it's going to save us 50 billion and that means we can reduce everyone's taxes. That's a very vague, but at least no one can really argue with it because you'd have to go into the real nitty gritty. As soon as you start saying we're going to cut, was it personal allowance, we're going to raise it up to 20 grand, that's a real policy that you can cost. And then people who I would say Reform voters feel pragmatic, they feel like pragmatic people, are going to see that and think, oh, that doesn't line up. And they're going to fall straight back to Conservatives if you do that. So it's I think they've got the easiest job, but they are risking making some mistakes here.
I agree. And absolutely, like their strength has been very much in the fact that people don't think they're going to have to actually implement it. And the moment they start coming, and this is the risk with what we were saying before, of course, reaching across the aisle, because you cannot take the voters you've currently accumulated as guaranteed. They can very easily go back to Conservatives. So what you're doing, Farage, I think, is being relatively arrogant in his sort of presumption that people are going to stay with him no matter what, because the Tories have been so bad for the last 14 years. And so, like you said, they've now come up with this policy to raise personal allowance. They want to cut the corporation tax, and our good old friends, the IFS, cost this to be about 90 billion or slightly more, about 100 and something billion. And that's not accounting for the extra spending. And so they want to increase spending by about 50 billion as well. So, I mean, we're talking about 150, 160-ish billion in promises here. And they say, we'll just cut it by cutting net zero and DEI and cutting wasteful government spending. And we've spoken about before. That's so vague. I mean, it's sort of... And Reform really have to realise that their strength is in a particular policy issue and try not to branch out too much in terms of talking to things that aren't their expertise. I think that's really important, because otherwise you're going to alienate your base, and you need the base. Especially as Reform critically is really relying on building up a ground game of councillors and local support. You need to have a strong base, which is sort of the lesson they could learn from the Lib Dems, I guess.
What, doing sort of a localised attack, you'd say?
Yeah, localised, and having a strong campaign on the ground. And to have that, you have to have unity in the party. You can't have policy issues coming from left, right and centre. You have to have a very clear ideological bias, and just like the Lib Dems are very narrow in their ideological vision. So I think Reform could learn something from that.
Well, just before we leave off Reform then, I would just summarise as you've got this big pot of money that you can say you can spend by saying you're going to cut net zero. That one you can get away with because the number is there and it's true, just no one else wants to cut it. Get rid of all this plans of cutting taxes for everyone. It's not costed, everyone's going to notice. And then you can be vague about how much you're going to save from reforming everything. And then Nigel needs to stop about the NHS turning into an insurance-based thing, because that is good point. A risk, to say that. So stop coming up with policy, basically, guys.
He just needs to not be Icarus. He needs to get away from that sun and just stay under the radar a little bit in terms of, and just be vague. And he could probably do very well doing that. I don't think he will. I really don't. Maybe we should do predictions as well, but I don't predict. I still think Reform will be the fourth biggest party at the next general election, because I think they'll make some mistakes.
Yeah, well, I've got a bet on with my friends that they won't be the second biggest party, and I think that's because eventually they'll have to do policy, and then the Tories can do the strategy that I think we're about to present, which is just say how rubbish Reform are, and I think you'll get a lot of those protest votes back.
So maybe we should move on to the Conservatives now, because I mean, I don't know about you, Jack, but the Conservatives is a puzzle, isn't it? It's one that it's a difficult one to fix, and I think I just wanted to highlight some of the reasons I think that we can all agree the Conservatives are going to struggle. Well, one is obviously the thing we've just been talking about. They are going to get squeezed from the right by Reform. They now don't have that base of votes to just rely on, where previously they have sort of have an advantageous position given there were so many more left-wing parties than right-wing parties. Now they don't have that. I mean, frankly, it's the total failure to convince people that they are a viable alternative to government. You know, they had 14 years in government, and like I think you said to me at one time, you know, anything Kimmy says now, it's like, well, it's a good idea, but you had 14 years to do it and you didn't do it. And so that's going to be a real issue for them. I think the Liz Truss effect is going to last a very, very long time. And not just the Liz Truss effect with the mini budget, etc., and just the instability. You know, people who vote Conservative, like you said, like to think of themselves as pragmatic, sensible people, conservative, stable people, and they don't like swapping and changing all the time. They like who they like, and I think that's going to be something that's so important. Something you see in the polling data, that inner instability is something that Labour's trying to capture now. And that's not going to be good for their voting base.
What's your idea, though? You said it's hard. I get that, but how are you going to? I've brought you in as a consultant.
So
what are you sitting them down and saying?
So let's talk about the Lib Dems. So the Lib Dems, no, sorry. Okay, so my idea for the Conservatives basically is to eat, as the great Malcolm Tucker said, eat a whole concrete mixer full of humble pie. I genuinely believe you have to just present a very humble argument, go around the country, admit that there was a lot of mistakes that were made, and then systematically remove all of the bad smells that linger from the last government. You just have to be a new, young, dynamic Conservative Party with a real vision, and you have to get rid of anyone who was associated with that last government. And I do truly, and especially the Liz Truss government.
Well, half of them lost their seats anyway, so I guess half of that job's done.
Yeah. Very good. No, but you have to just create a new, young-faced David Cameron in his prime sort of vision of the Conservative Party, and someone who's a very good speaker, very visionary, and someone who you would trust with finances, because that's what people want who vote Conservative. They want fiscally conservative, small c conservative, socially dynamic, charismatic leader. And at the moment, Kemi isn't that at all. And I think you need policies that support pensioners, reduce government waste, reduce taxes, and are kind to small business. And that's like your game plan, I think, if you're a Conservative. And you need to sort of trump up this like anti-naive left-wing narrative and anti-populist narrative. And you have to get rid of Kemi. I mean, Kemi is completely awful.
I think it's coming more and more clear that she's a stopgap for someone like James Cleverly to finally come in when the going gets serious. She can eat all the, eat up all the horrible questions that they're going to get for the first few years, and then they can come back in and be like, right, we're new, we're starting fresh. And for me, their strategy has to be make Reform look like a naive party that aren't actually going to be able to deliver. Yeah. Point out every time they make a silly mistake, because they are basically a group of wildcards. Something's going to be said, they're going to do silly things, it's going to happen. Nigel's putting out a lot of policies that are just don't add up. You can turn around and be like, look, do you want someone like that? Or we hear you, but you want something serious, right?
And you need,
and they'll come back
to you. That's a perfect way of putting it. And I think James Cleverly would have been the perfect person for that. Just sit in the background, make sensible policy decisions, calmly and concisely put across your argument, and just slowly regain and be a new Conservative Party. You can't have any of the Rees Moggs, or what's his name, Chris Phillipson, is that his name? All of the old sort of people that still remain, they have to go, in my opinion. But it is incredibly, and it almost takes completely reworking the Conservative Party. And obviously the people who are there at the moment don't want to be reworked. So that's going to be a hard vision for themselves. And I think they're going to really struggle in the next election. I don't think it's going to get much better for them anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't think anything they could say is going to win the next election for them, in my opinion. But you've got to be thinking 2 elections forward.
In my mind, the next one's just a survival strategy. Just survive, and slowly start changing the vision. In my mind, I think Labour's going to win the next one. You're not going to change that. In my opinion.
Well, it all depends on Labour's messaging. So is that where we're going? Are we talking about Lib Dems or Labour next?
Let's do Lib Dem, I think.
All right.
Because I think the Labour one is probably the one we probably both feel the most passionately about, I guess. So maybe end on that one. Okay, vision of the Lib Dems, and I feel very strongly about obviously this side of the political spectrum. And I really want the Lib Dems to be a big player. They're going to have a huge role in. I think they could become the second biggest party. With the way the Conservatives are acting, I do think if they had a competent, charismatic Nick Clegg style leader, obviously he had his own issues, but style of leader, you can have it. And what you need is for the Lib Dems, you want to go for strategically, you want to, one, get rid of Ed Davey. The guy is completely inadequate. And it drives me genuinely insane because they are wasting an unbelievable political opportunity to make real change in this country. And Ed Davey's too busy falling off of water slides and jet skis and... What did you say? He was doing a dance on TikTok?
No. I need to bring this up, Charlie, because I understand the old plan was fall off the waterboard or whatever to point out how big the water pollution scandal was. He's bringing attention to both the Liberal Democrats and a big issue. Now he's just looking like an idiot for minor, small policies. Well, non-policies, really. So he has a little short or TikTok where he does the Trump dance like this, and he says, "There's this guy. He's called President Trump, and he's messing with our trade, and it's hurting us." And it just comes across off the cuff, like he hasn't planned it, like he's an idiot, like he's just saying things. And I just think it's not serious. And if you want to be the second biggest party and actually benefit from this Labour disillusionment, you've got to look like a serious party. And this is not it. I mean, you're raising awareness for... This thing was raising awareness for buying British. That's not even a policy. You're looking like an idiot without even raising awareness to in the past case, pollution in water, which was a big deal.
Absolutely. I really feel bad for our Spotify audience because they didn't get to see you do that little dance, but it was immaculate, I must say. Yeah. He's coming across as a joke. And I mean, he is a joke, and he's a lovely person from what I've heard behind the scenes, and I'm sure he's a great person. He obviously does amazing things for his son, and it's incredible. But as a political leader, he's completely inadequate, and his political opportunism blinkers are just not working because this is a real changing of the guard. And if they don't do anything, I don't think it's going to change. And the Lib Dems could become a real player again. And what they need to do is they need to keep their focus on the local, because I think that's really important, and that is their thing. They have like when we're in Bath, working. I mean, the city lights up yellow, doesn't it? I mean, when elections are around, it is incredible what the Lib Dems can do when they mobilise. And so you need to have that sort of local power, but at the same time, you can only get so far with local issues in scope in terms of what people care about. You need a big strategic macro idea, and there are some things that I think that sort of commands the centre with strength, and you need to take issues, and the Lib Dems could capitalise on, joining the customs union. I think there is a lot more appeal now in UK politics. There's a lot of people have now crossed that voting age to joining the customs union again. I think you could really don't push the single market or anything, I don't think, but push joining the customs union. You could push like Global Britain pro high skilled immigration while being strict on illegal and low skill immigration. You can also push, you could really command the education policy, because no one's talking about education. Obviously, we feel very strongly about that. Lib Dems are very strong at talking about education. They could very much do that. The NHS and social care, which they are currently doing, but then they need a broader tax policy. They need a broader economic policy in general, and they need a vision for what the UK would look like if they led. And I don't want them falling into this just opposition and just support party, because that's not who they are, and they are very unique in their ideological outlook compared to Labour, and so, or the Conservatives. And I think a lot of people in the UK fit into the Lib Dem bracket. And so they really are wasting an opportunity, and Ed Davey needs to go, I think.
Yeah, because when I first thought about Lib Dems, I thought they were actually quite hard sell, because Labour had sort of taken up more of the central part, which is where Lib Dem would normally sit, somewhere between Tories and Labour. But now, actually, the way you sold it there is that there are a lot of issues, big issues, that Labour aren't focusing on because there's just not enough time to focus on all of these, right? So things like education, things like rejoining customs union. I also think Lib Dems could come across like more of the compassionate party, because Labour have, in their messaging, really lost the sense that they're for the people. I think they come across technocratic, which obviously we love, and I like Labour for that. But they do feel like they're losing their soul a little bit, and especially with things like their immigration policy, which I know a lot of people will like, but their messaging on it was quite reform-esque, to be honest. Like, it was make it sound like immigrants were almost vilified, in my opinion, whereas Lib Dems are a little bit more pro-immigration. And I think even if you don't say about loosening the immigration rules, you could still make it sound more like they're welcome and we don't want people who make them feel unwelcome.
What did you call it? The anti-woke. I think that's quite a good way of putting it. Like, you're not coming across woke, but you're just pushing back gently against this populist anti-woke sentiment, which is, I think, is now actually having a resurgence in popularity. Be like, no, you know what? Woke is actually originally a positive thing. It's just the extremists that get a little bit out of hand. But and I think there is definitely a place on the spectrum for the Lib Dems, and I feel like it's a shame, and they won't get rid of Ed Davey, I don't think, because he did objectively quite well in the election, but that was not because of Ed Davey, I don't believe. I think it was just a disillusionment with the two main parties, and he just happened to be there. I don't think it means he's a good leader. I think he would have done better with it differently.
I think this is a prime time to fill the gaps of where Labour are missing.
Absolutely.
And that will set you up perfectly for when Labour probably needs to go into coalition next election, and then you would fit in perfectly, because you're talking about the bits that they're not. I think that would work really nicely.
Lib Dems are some of the most hire some of the most experts and technocrats of any political party. I mean, if you want to look for like an economic advisory job, you're probably best off looking in the Lib Dems for local MPs and stuff. So if you wanted to work for a political party, so they have a lot of expertise there, and I'm sure they could definitely utilise that. Cool. Do you have anything more to say on this one, or should we go to the big one?
I think we should move on to the big one. I just want to say, though, quickly, that the reason I'm so hard on Lib Dem is that I feel almost most affiliated with them, in my opinion. So I'm a globalist. I believe in these things, and because they've let me down in the way they've presented themselves and not having a real set of policies. That's why I'm a little bit harsh on them, I think.
No, likewise.
I don't want to make people to think that I'm anti them in a
I
certain
really
way,
want Lib Dems to do well. I mean, I probably associate Labour, Lib Dem as sort of our area. So but that's why we're particularly harsh on them. Well said.
Labour then.
Labour.
Where do you think?
Yeah. So we've spoken about this before, Jack, and so I guess the problems that Labour have, well, like my main problems with Labour currently is that they limited themselves way too much in terms of their general election pledges. It was very clear that they were going to win very early on, and I think it would have been better if they'd taken some political risk in the short term and possibly lost a few seats to be able to do actually what they wanted to do and raise taxes and have a little bit more scope, because they limited themselves a lot. So I think that's partially why their job is so difficult. And then they've made their life bloody difficult. They are, I think you've said before, they are good technocrats and good technically policy people, but they are awful, awful politicians. And so you have the national insurance contribution was a terrible idea for businesses, as was the perceived corruption by Rachel Reeves. Obviously she had the whole Wikipedia, writing her book. She did not work for the Bank of England as long as she said she did. She had this expenses scandal, and people just generally don't like her. And she comes across very cold in her attitude toward policy. The winter fuel allowance was an example of that. Like, I very much support the removal of the winter fuel allowance. I'll say that very openly and proudly. But that was a bad policy decision, the way it was handled. And a lot of the things they do are correct, in my opinion, apart from the national insurance contribution. But broadly, they are correct, but they handle it in a way and a messaging that is truly terrible. And I think you said before, they don't give themselves credit for the small but important things that they're doing that no one never makes it on the news, no one ever hears about. We obviously look at this quite in depth. But there are good, positive things, lots of little things that are going to make a big difference. But because they didn't have the new Labour central bank independence, they've seen this faltering support very, very quickly. And so I think they did well on foreign policy, but I think people are now seeing that he thinks he's sort of sucking up to Trump too much. I disagree, but I think that's a perception that people are thinking. And also, I think another thing that Labour is always going to have to deal with is the right-wing bias of the UK media, with the Murdochs, Paul Dacres and Daily Mails, and Telegraph. It's really difficult to break that in the UK, the right-wing bias in the media. So I think those are sort of the obstacles they're facing. And I think it's all a result of them just they don't have a good media strategy. They are not charismatic. I can't think of a single sort of charismatic visionary in the Labour government. And
Yeah. Well, I think one major thing is just going to be that their policies have been on the right wing side of Labour. I mean, some would say even beyond that.
Yeah.
So they are disillusioning people by cutting health benefits and then being tighter on immigration. Those are things that you'd associate more with Tories and reform. So maybe part of it's that, but I think even more than that is that their message of what Labour stands for isn't above that at all. Like, you hear about the things that are negative first, and then you don't really have an idea of their vision. I think what sums it up is how, I mean, I've said they are awful politicians because the messaging is not clear. I'm not going to get you to try and guess what were in their 5 pledges.
Well, I don't know what they
before.
are. Yeah.
And you still don't,
I still don't know
yesterday
what they are. Yeah,
that
it was
we went
yesterday we
through
talked
them.
about it. I still don't know what they are.
But the point is that they've got 5 pledges that no one can remember. Then you've got 6 steps, which are different to the 5 pledges, and then 3 foundations, where one of the foundations is not included in the 5 pledges. So there's such mixed messages, and you don't really know what they stand for. I was convinced that house building was one of their pledges, but it's not. But they did make a big thing about it. It's like one of the only things they actually had a target, like 1.5 million houses. Are they meeting it? No, coincidentally. So maybe it's a good thing they didn't have it as pledge.
It was like with the boats as well. It was like smash the gangs. It's like, what does that mean? You know, I heard that. I don't know what that means. And yeah, like you said, they just don't have a vision.
Yeah, I don't find the messaging incredibly appealing. I think I like something you've always said, which is a phrase which is a subscription in a country that works. I like that.
Yeah.
If you sold people a message of none of our public sector's services work, point to a single one, they're all broken, justice system, people are spilling out of prisons and things, they're not working, let's fix them.
Yeah.
That's something you can sell.
But I was thinking about this as well. It's sort of beyond that, actually. I was thinking about this last night, is because Labour's come across very negative. We haven't spoken about this yet, but they are very they're very negative. And that's difficult to get behind. You're sort of selling a negative vision of the UK. The UK is broken. The UK is crumbling. You know, the black hole, the failed Tory government. And I do think the messaging massively has to change, not just for politics, but economics as well. Economics is about people. And it's about investment, and it's about positive animal spirits, as Keynes always used to say. So you need that positive messaging. And that's the thing that Thatcher, Winston Churchill, the great Prime Minister Tony Blair, even Cameron, that's what they had. They had that vision in Britain, and their own different vision in Britain. And that has patriotism, that has references to British grit and gumption and resolve. And it has that sort of being proud to be British and a vision for the future, no matter what was gone wrong in the past. And I think you really need to sell a vision of, imagine a country where you can send your kid to school. They go to school 9 to 5, they get sports, they get arts training, they get scientific and STEM training, and they're happy and healthy. You can get an appointment for your child or you or whenever you want. Your dad who has cancer is going to get an appointment and he's going to get the best care he can, and it's all going to be free. You can have childcare free at the point of access. You can have, you know, roads that work, perfect digital infrastructure. You can have employment opportunities, and you're going to have strong employment rights that are going to be protected. And yes, you're going to have to pay more in tax, and you just are, to be able to fund this stuff. But you're also going to have a country that facilitates the best of people. And you're going to have safe streets. We're going to pay for more police officers, and your money is going to go towards stuff where you feel safe, happy, and secure. And yes, you might feel like you have a bit less money, but it's not going to matter as much because the things that you need are going to be there for you, and you're going to have that security. And at the moment, I feel like we have a country that you do not feel secure in your finances a lot of the time, because if something goes wrong in Britain, a lot of time, you know, there is not the support there necessarily to deal with it. And that doesn't have to come through benefits. That can come through the public system in general. And that's the message that Labour have to sell. And I like to say, you know, I think you're right in saying it's a bit technocratic to talk like this, but it's a bit like, you know, supply side social democracy. It's like left wing that is efficient, effective, and safe. And because a lot of the criticism the left wing get from the right is it's naive, it's what they call it, it's not real economics, it's silly, it's a bit fantasy land. But realistically, a lot of economists do believe in the left wing vision anyway. So that's a story the left wing never really fight for some reason. But you've got to sell the argument of it. Yeah, okay, fine, childcare costs a lot to subsidise publicly, but women are a more educated side of the workforce, and they make up half of the workforce, and yet we immediately take them out of the workforce by not giving them free, or at least very well subsidised childcare. And that economically makes no sense. And so you can sell each of these respective issues by, yes, it costs a lot, but think about the return on the investment. Getting women into the workforce, and that not just good socially, but it's good for taxes, it's good for children, it's good for everyone, it's good for them. And so I think that's the message that Labour really need to sell, of a positive vision rather than a bobble fix it vision.
No, I agree. Sell the future, and it's a future where public sector services work. That would be beautiful, I think. And what I would love them, this is now talking about the method of getting to people. I think they're making a mistake by thinking when you do a massive long speech, which is an hour, that you're speaking directly to people. You're not. When you release these 5 pledges, they went on the news for one day and then everyone forgot about them. If you want it to get into the public, you either reach them directly through social media, which would work because their base is young, so they would use that. And then for the rest, I think you rely on really pumping the media. For 1 month, you talk about one issue. Second month, you talk about another issue. I believe Alistair Campbell.
That's a new Labour strategy,
presenting
isn't it?
that idea. But I think to keep it in the news that you're focusing on, these are the issues you care about. Because currently, all that's coming out is you're cutting health allowance to universal credit. You're cutting immigration in quite a mean and harmful way. So
absolutely, and that's the new Labour thing. Cut child poverty, education, and like Good Friday. Central bank independence, things that were very, very clear what they wanted to do. And the difference between then and now is that I have no idea. Yeah, Tony Blair was global Britain, global. And you might say that doesn't work today, whatever, politically, but at least it was a vision. And Labour don't have that. Yeah.
And then my final point is that this vision has to be seen as a long-term investment. I would be selling this, I know it's risky, but I wouldn't be selling it in 5 years. They keep all their targets at 5 years' time. I just don't think it's possible. I think the public would believe you if you had said, this is going to take 10 years, but we're convinced that 10 years of us in government, we'll be able to make this system work. And by the end of that, we'll have public system services that are at least in the recovery stage, which is more than you can say now.
Absolutely. Well, I think that was very enlightening. I think, to be honest, we've done really well. I think you can probably tell we're more passionate about one side than the other. But in general, we gave objective advice to each party. Look at us go.
You're right.
I'm just hoping that one side listens to it more than the other. And I just
I'm a bit worried that Reform will listen to what you just said.
I don't think Reform will be listening to us.
Not a chance, is it?
Not a chance.
Right, Charlie.
Anyway.
That was brilliant. Okay, I'll see you next time, yeah?
I'll see you next time. Good to see you, Jack. Hello, everyone. This is Charlie, Jack's better half. If you like the episode, please do consider giving us a like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and a follow and a 5-star if you're on Spotify. It really does help us out.